Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It is Thursday, March 13th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with Times of Israel founding editor David Horovitz. Hi, David.
Hey, Jessica.
Hi there. It is day 524 of the war. Israel's hostage negotiating team remained in Doha, Qatar overnight, as Palestinian reports said that the U.S. is pushing a 60-day ceasefire in return for the release of 10 hostages, while Israeli officials retorted that the negotiating team hasn't received any proposal of that kind. U.S. President Donald Trump said Wednesday that his plans for the Gaza Strip do not include any plan for expelling Palestinians. And in Israel, the government coalition is gearing up for 2 intensive weeks in order to pass the budget and approve controversial legislation regarding the judicial overhaul. We'll talk about those headlines and some others after a quick break. Okay, David, you wrote an open letter yesterday to Trump's Mideast envoy, Steve Witkoff, asking him to do in Qatar what he did 2 months ago in pushing forward the hostage deal that ended, in essence, 2 weeks ago, or the release of hostages that ended 2 weeks ago. And I wanted to ask you about your letter, the open letter aspect of it, because, of course, release hostages keep on mentioning and thanking Steve Witkoff, and then you wrote this open letter to him. And I'm wondering what pushed you to do that.
Well, the fact is that for many, many months, really from May of last year until January, there was a proposal that Israel had approved, that the Prime Minister had approved, that was conveyed, that was basically presented by then President Joe Biden at the end of May for a phased release of hostages, mass murdering terrorists and other Palestinian detainees, and a ceasefire. And after Israel had approved it, Netanyahu added new conditions, including regarding the Egypt-Gaza border, the Philadelphia corridor, and so on, and made all kinds of statements about how if Israel ever stopped the war, it would be the international community wouldn't allow it to go back, and that Israel's presence on the Egypt-Gaza border was central to Israel's very existence. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the message he delivered. And although he subsequently said that Hamas was refusing to move ahead with the deal and the problems with Hamas were with Hamas, the fact is that he was not pushing hard. He was raising objections to it. And then along came the American presidential elections, and Donald Trump was elected for a second time and started issuing ultimatums to Hamas and saying, this has to get done. This deal has to get done before I take office, and dispatched Steve Witkoff. And lo and behold, after 7-8 months of prime ministerial procrastination, they signed the deal. And 2 days after it was signed, Hamas started releasing hostages and Israel keeping its side of the bargain and so on. And yet here we are now again, as you rightly said, phase one ended after 42 days. The 33 hostages who were supposed to be released were released, 8 of them dead. In some cases, in appalling and horrific circumstances, this played out, but it did play out. The people who were supposed to go free went free. But the deal also provided for talks on the second phase, in which we think 24 living hostages could be released, and Netanyahu did not move ahead with those negotiations, violating the deal, and has said, of course, that Hamas violated the deal in many ways, including at one point threatening to not release hostages with the propaganda ceremonies and so on. And therefore, it seems to me, first thing is we're in a ridiculous situation, that's a polite word. Netanyahu has been adamant throughout this war that what is needed is to destroy Hamas and to get all the hostages out, and that intensive military pressure is central to getting all the hostages out. And at the moment, for more than 2 weeks now and counting, the opposite is the situation. The situation is that there is a ceasefire, which is fantastic for Hamas. Aid is flowing in. It can rearm. All kinds of reports about them building roadside bombs with unexploded ordnance that they're collecting all over Gaza, recruiting new gunmen, certainly reorganizing it in any practical level without any threat of consequence from the Israeli army, and no obligation to release hostages. And added to that sense of anguish and missing opportunity here is the fact that we know from hostages who came out in the very last few days that they left behind people who are being tortured and are chained and are being beaten and are being psychologically abused. We know this now in the most direct sense. And therefore, it seems to me that the only person really who might be able to, I mean, why is some of this happening? Part of the background for this, I'm sorry to go on, but you asked me, Netanyahu is always perpetually worried that his coalition is going to fall apart, worried from even before October the 7th, as though the ultra-Orthodox parties and the far-right parties had a different coalition that they could have joined, which of course they didn't. And therefore, it has always been inexplicable that he gave them so much power, so much susceptibility to their demands, shall we say. Right, so he thinks Bezalel Smotrich is going to bring down the coalition if they agree to a phase 2, which provides for an end to the war. Why would he think that? Well, Steve Witkoff, you can explain to him that, of course, the United States will back a return to war. And I would say if and when, but it's not if, when Hamas breaches the ceasefire, as it is already doing with all of its preparatory activities for further violence. So get the hostages out. And then, yes, America will back you as needed when the time comes, and it won't take long, when you feel and can demonstrate an obligation to go after Hamas again. In other words, bottom line, Netanyahu needs to be more worried about the Trump administration and Steve Witkoff than he needs to be about the ultra-Orthodox political leadership and Bezalel Smotrich. So I hope you read the piece I wrote. I don't think any of it would have been news to him. This is a very smart person with, not been in this job for a long time, great success. The hostage families felt that here is somebody who is empathetic, who is earnest, who is compassionate. And therefore, I'm sure he's going to try and do his best to get out as many hostages as quickly as possible.
Right. David, you bring up the coalition, you bring up the government, you bring up the ultra-Orthodox, which brings us to another topic that we wanted to talk about today. And this, these 2 weeks of a flurry of legislative action because they want to pass the budget, because in order to not have the government fall, not to have this coalition fall, they need to pass the budget and move forward on these very controversial legislation regarding the judicial overhaul or aspects of it. So even though I wasn't necessarily planning to get to this at this moment in our podcast, I think we're there. You and Biranit Goren, who is the editor of Zman Yisrael, our sister Hebrew site, referred to this 2-week break, in a sense, that Netanyahu has given to Hamas to, as you said, to sort of take care of business in Gaza, to make preparations, to haul in all the humanitarian aid that's coming in and to do what they want with it. And in the meantime, Netanyahu's coalition is working hard to stay in power by passing the budget. Talk us through that a little bit. Talk us through the steps that what we're seeing right now in the government in terms of legislation and what it actually means.
Well, the law, there's no wiggle room on this. The law states that the state budget for 2025 has to be passed, has to become a law by March the 31st, which is a little over 2 weeks. Otherwise, the government falls. There are new elections. If the government does not pass a budget by the end of this month, we will have new elections in Israel. And therefore, since you have a prime minister who understandably wants to stay in power, that's a major priority for him. His problem with that is in that context and in the context of Gaza, he doesn't want to alienate Smotrich, and because if Smotrich votes against the budget or doesn't turn up, and the other far-right party, Otzma Yehudit, who are already in opposition and completely unreliable in every respect, he worries that he would not have a majority. He wouldn't indeed have a majority if Smotrich were to vote against the budget, for example, right? Smotrich's party. Add to his complications, shall we say, the ultra-Orthodox parties are not entirely on board with everything the coalition is doing, and certainly one of the two ultra-Orthodox parties, or part of it, a faction in the United Torah Judaism Party, is openly threatening to let the budget fall if legislation is not passed to enshrine in law their outrageous, unequal, and untenable exclusion of ultra-Orthodox young men from any kind of national service. Right? We're it's 16, 17 months now into a war. The army is incredibly short of people, doesn't have enough soldiers, has been calling people back. As you know, reservists have done 200, 300, 400 days of reserve duty. People who are not supposed to be in the army, people who have lives and families and businesses. right? And yet the government continues. I mean, this has been going on for decades, but continues at this most acute time in terms of staffing soldiers to try to mollify the ultra-Orthodox political leadership and their demand to have enshrined in law the continued exclusion of the ultra-Orthodox from military service. So Netanyahu doesn't want to offend them either, because God forbid they should vote against the budget and therefore doom his coalition. So those are the things that I would say are obligatory from the perspective of the political survival of the coalition. Added to that, however, is the resumption. It never entirely went away, but the full speed ahead resumption of some aspects of the judicial overhaul. Now, there are other people who regard this as less drastic than I do, the overhaul. I consider the overhaul, I think that's an understatement. It's a revolution in the way Israel is governed. If it goes through in all of the elements that the coalition and its justice minister, backed by its prime minister, have set out, it is the end of judicial independence in Israel. It means there is only one branch of government in Israel, and that would be the political majority. The Knesset already has no independent power if you have a strong coalition. If it has a majority, it can ram through whatever legislation it wants. And the only defense, the only protection of any of our rights, no constitution here, no other provisions, the only defense, the only break on the abuse of basic rights is the Supreme Court and the judicial system. And these laws, if they all go through, basically, they neuter the Supreme Court, they destroy its independence, they destroy its capacity to intervene, and they politicize the entire court and leave it basically dominated by the political majority. Now, not all of the laws on that are being pushed through right now, but a really crucial one is, and that's a law that would change the way judges are selected by changing the composition of the Judicial Selection Committee. And unbelievably, and it is unbelievable, the schedule for this legislation now is that they want to try and push it through and get it into law by, well, less than a week from where we are now, Jessica. 6 days from now, they want to have legislated a law that gives the political echelon control over the selection of Israel's judges. Again, you people listening in America, well, it's a very politicized process in America as well. Yes, but in America, you have a constitution. You have a legislative hierarchy that constitutes some kind of an impediment to total control by the executive level. We don't have that here. And therefore, the notion that they would ram this legislation through in 6 days, I mean, that's what they're going to try and do, apparently. We shall see if they do it. And one final thing, of course, is they are trying to fire the Attorney General. In a different climate, I don't know how much this has been discussed in the last few days on the podcast, but the Attorney General in Israel fulfills two roles. It's very unusual, I think. It's certainly potentially problematic. He or she is the head of the prosecution and also the chief legal advisor to the government. It is perfectly legitimate, for example, to say, well, maybe we should be splitting those roles. Is there some potential conflict of interest there? Is it too much to place on one person's shoulders and so on? If it was being examined, changing that role in the context of a government that was working with the opposition and trying to find sensible arrangements, great. That is not the case here. The Prime Minister is seeking to fire the Attorney General because she objects, for example, to the undemocratic reality in which he is trying to enshrine ultra-Orthodox exclusion from military and national service. She's annoying because she tells the coalition when they are breaching the basic principles of equality and democracy and ill-treating the citizenry. And again, this is on the agenda now. That is not going to get pushed through this month. There simply isn't enough time for all the technical processes. So they're not going to be able to fire the Attorney General by the end of the month, but they're moving ahead with those efforts as well.
Okay, let's take a quick break. When we're back, we'll talk about a statement that US President Donald Trump made yesterday. Stay with us. Okay, switching gears again. During a press conference with the Irish Prime Minister in the White House in the Oval Office, President Trump declared yesterday when the Irish Prime Minister was asked about this statement that Trump had made about changes in the Gaza Strip expelling Palestinians, Trump said, he declared, nobody's expelling any Palestinians. In a sense, a softening of the statement that he made 6 weeks now at this point, a month ago, when he came forward with his plans for the Gaza Strip and what it could be like, and this idea of moving all Gazans, moving all Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip, which of course we've seen in the last weeks as the Arab states met, as there have been comments, as there have been plans being made. This is not something that anyone wants to see happen, or certainly not those who would be involved in it. And David, you wanted to comment on this, so I want to hear what you have to say about his statement.
Well, this is the one in a series of comments that the president has made. It goes back to when Prime Minister Netanyahu was at the White House and Trump really unveiled in the two public sessions that they had there elements of this vision of a Gaza in which Gazans would not be living. They would all be relocated to Jordan, Egypt, and other countries. And Trump spoke about some kind of vision of a Middle East Riviera, spoke about it in real estate terms. Then the White House tried to, and he was asked, is this a temporary relocation of Gazans? He said, no, permanent. And then the White House tried to walk it back a bit, and he kind of came back and said, no, I meant what I said, kind of thing. And then, of course, that precipitated some movement in the Arab world, which is ongoing, and there's interaction between his officials and Arab foreign ministers. I think Steve Witkoff is meeting with Arab foreign ministers about it. Maybe even in the next few hours. So Egypt hosted a summit and came up with its own plan, which, the Trump plan is not realistic, and I'll elaborate on that in a second, but it certainly galvanized something, except what it galvanized in the Arab world is a plan that is also unrealistic, I don't think the Egyptian-led, Arab-endorsed plan mentions the word Hamas. So, that's a rather large elephant in the room if you're trying to discuss how to handle Gaza. So now you've got the president, and, he would say, this is not a departure from what I said. Nobody's really expelling people. We're going to build wonderful places for them to live. And, but among the big issues in the Trump plan is if you're going to relocate lots of Gazans, by what right do you do that? Secondly, if you're going to send them to, say, Egypt and Jordan, isn't that going to radically destabilize two countries that are just about holding it together? I mean, does Israel, for example, whose longest border is with Jordan, want hundreds of thousands of hostile Palestinians relocated there in a kingdom that has its own issues with Islamic extremism? And then, of course, at the heart of this also, the Trump part is, well, you want Hamas destroyed, you want Hamas eradicated, as Marco Rubio said a couple of weeks ago. How do you distinguish between Hamas and those people who Trump calls wonderful people in Gaza? Now, some of those people in Gaza who may not be carrying guns are certainly supporting Hamas. And when you're relocating all these people, how are you going to make sure the Hamas people don't go out? Or do you want them to go out as well? Or where do you want them to, and they should be with the rest of the Gazans? I mean, even trying to explain how this might play out underlines that it's complicated, So there's a bit of a shift of tone from the president, who indeed had never said we're going to expel them. He kept saying, they're going to want to go. We're going to build beautiful places for them to live. So he would say, I'm clarifying, this is in their interest, not an expulsion. But the bottom line is, and still not entirely contradicted by him, he has been talking about the permanent relocation of all Gazans. Now he's saying we're not going to expel them. Does that mean nonetheless, well, that means they're not going to be relocated, or only that he still thinks they'll want to be relocated rather than expelled? I don't know.
Yeah. David, just before we wrap it up, just one final question for you. We started by talking about the open op-ed letter that you wrote to Steve Witkoff, to Trump's Mideast envoy, and he is in Doha right now, theoretically working on these hostage negotiations. And then we have Trump walking back his statement, or changing it, or changing the tone. We started out in this podcast by you saying how he was stating before he was even inaugurated, President Donald Trump, that he wanted this to all be done before he came into office. And of course, that wasn't possible because this is a situation that has existed before he came into office, and there are so many complicated parts to it. But as we, sit here now in mid-March, I'm just wondering how you are looking at all of it. Do we think it's possible to find a way to wrap up, at least to bring home the remaining hostages, to do this, as some of the hostage families say, they want their hostages who are dead, they want them back and buried before Israel's Memorial Day in early May? I just wanted to know your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I don't think anyone can predict anything, Jessica. I really don't. I think it's foolhardy. Things move. You just look at what happened in Syria. Overnight, Syria became a different entity. That's just one of the more recent developments that was not widely seen coming, shall we say. I don't think that Trump believed it was and was even declaredly seeking that all of this would be over before he took office. He wanted a deal in place and the hostages to start coming out. And lo and behold, that's what happened. Is it potentially realistic to think that more living hostages might be released within days? Potentially so. That's what Steve Witkoff is trying to work on. That's what the Israeli government says that it wants to happen. And Hamas says it claims to be bound by the phase deal, under which, if they negotiate a second phase, and that might not be the framework that moves ahead now, but under which more hostages would be released. So is it possible that more hostages could be released fairly soon? I certainly hope so. And I don't think it's an absurd scenario, but it's not done yet. And until it's done, we know things can go wrong at the very last moment. All wrapped up by May, all of the living and dead hostages released by May, it could happen. I don't think there's a powerful reason to believe that is likely to happen, but we don't know. We don't know. It's a question of will. Remember, at the heart of what I wrote to Steve Witkoff yesterday is calling Hamas's bluff, right? This is an incredibly cynical, despicable, mass-murdering, would-be genocidal terrorist organization. And what I'm saying is they're going to breach the deal. So if we can get the hostages out and America can make it clear to Israel that when Hamas breaches the deal, we return to the fighting, that's what we should be doing. But Hamas is, in this equation as well. And they know all of those possibilities. They know that they'll want to breach the deal. They know that if they release all the hostages, they will have given up a core element of their leverage. They're not sitting somewhere in a closed, sealed room, not aware of what is being discussed. I'm basically advocating being as cynical as Hamas is. I'm advocating committing to a deal because we know the other side's going to break it. On the other hand, if Hamas were to become what Adam Bola, the US hostage envoy, believes, which is not going to happen, and not be Hamas anymore, then great. Release all the hostages, lay down your arms, take no further role in the politics of Gaza, as Adam Bola believes is going to happen. Again, it isn't. Then nobody has done anything dishonest in this deal. They've gone ahead with the deal, and what a surprise. Hamas kept it. The hostages came home, and everything was wonderful for the third time. It's not going to happen, but that's a basis on which you can try and make progress. Sure, maybe Hamas will keep the deal. Meantime, we'll keep the deal, release the hostages. Let's see how it plays out.
Okay. Thanks, David. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jessica.
And thanks to you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. We'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Always feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, take care. Be well.